Good evening, everyone. I'll share a story my grandmother used to tell us. She said that when she was young, a big rumor spread through the small town she lived in, deep in rural Kansas. People were talking about a werewolf roaming around the area. Many residents even described what the creature looked like. They said it was tall, skinny, with twisted legs, long arms, hunched shoulders, and a head that resembled a pig. While some thought these were just stories, others showed damage supposedly caused by the creature on their properties. Next door to my grandmother lived an elderly couple who were loved by everyone on the street. In their backyard, they had many fruit trees, and they kept chickens that laid eggs every day. Because of this, the couple would share fruits and eggs with the neighbors. When the werewolf sighting rumors reached their neighborhood, everyone got frightened. People began to hear dogs barking through the night, and on the dirt roads, they could hear something running very quickly back and forth. The next morning, they'd find large footprints in the ground, bigger than a horse's hoof, with what looked like claw marks. This werewolf would jump over house fences and attack the animals of the residents. Sometimes it even walked on the rooftops. It didn't howl, but made sounds like a pig, and at times, it sounded like a dog stalking something. However, it only went to homes with animals to feed on. The elderly couple next door had plenty of chickens and an old dog that was blind in one eye. But that dog was their faithful companion, treated like a family member. My grandmother said some neighbors started suspecting this elderly couple because the werewolf never attacked their chickens. Then one day, the elderly woman explained that nearly every night, the werewolf would stop in front of their house, growling, trying to jump the fence, but then backing off for some reason. It seemed to be afraid of the blind dog. The dog slept outside, and whenever the werewolf passed, the dog would stand in the middle of the yard, watching it. But one day, a homeless man came by asking for food, and when he clapped his hands in front of the couple's house, the dog attacked him, which was strange because it was usually a gentle dog. The dog bit the man's legs and arm, and the man drew a knife and killed the dog. The elderly couple was furious and cursed at the man, who left shouting. That same day, the couple went to their daughter's house, who was married and lived in another part of town. They likely went to tell her about their loyal companion's death. That night, my grandmother and her family were woken by a loud ruckus coming from the elderly couple's house. The chickens were in a panic, and they could hear loud banging on the wooden windows. At dawn, everyone rushed to the elderly couple's house. The front door was smashed, and inside, everything was overturned. All that was left of the chickens were feathers and feet. Soon after, the elderly couple returned with their daughter, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief because they thought the couple had come back home the night before. The poor couple cried when they saw what was left of their house and chickens. The daughter gathered what remained and took them to live with her. What people know is that as long as the blind dog was alive, somehow, it protected the elderly couple. The werewolf continued to roam that area for many years, causing trouble for the residents, until one day, it disappeared, and no one ever heard of it again. Thank you for sharing my story, and good night, everyone. I'm going to share something disturbing that haunted my family in the 80s. It all happened because of a debt my late father owed. My name is Clayton. At the time, I was 11 years old, and I remember exactly how everything happened. We were a family of 6, father, mother, and 4 kids. In the neighborhood we lived in, there were a lot of small grocery stores, and for a long time my father had a tab at one of them. This one, in particular, was owned by the wealthiest family in town. The descendants of this family still live there, so I won't disclose the town or the people involved. It was widely known that, besides owning the grocery store, this family also lent money with exorbitant interest rates, and those who couldn't pay on time faced serious consequences. I remember it was December of '86, and my father was desperate, searching for work. He wanted us to have a Christmas dinner, and we also needed new clothes. So, he made the bad decision of borrowing money from that family. I don't know the exact amount, but it must have been high. After the holiday season, things returned to normal. The drought was relentless, and finding work on the farms was almost impossible. It didn't take long for the debt collectors to start showing up, and it was terrifying. Everyone feared this family. It was a fear disguised as respect because people knew terrible stories about them. Disappearing entire families, burning down the homes of the poor with people inside. There was a dark aura around that family, but in some way, they had a grip on the locals. The bank wouldn't lend money to the poor, so they dominated the small town. One afternoon, I was in the yard sweeping leaves when a black truck stopped abruptly in front of our house. 4 men got out and asked for my father. I told them he was at work. One of them said, "Tell your father his debt is overdue. He has 2 days to pay." That evening, my father came home, exhausted and hungry. I told him about the visit, and he said not to worry because he'd found a job and would be able to pay off the loan installments. But that's not what happened. The job didn't even last 2 days, and every day their henchmen were at our house threatening us. They'd say, "You're not going to pay? You deadbeats? You don't know who you're dealing with." One morning, I was on my way to school, leaving early because it was far. I had to walk through many open fields. On the way, I saw a man approaching on horseback. He stopped next to me and said, "You're the deadbeat son, right? Give him a message. Tell him the debt will be collected differently starting today." I was terrified of that man. He was stern, bearded. I ran home as fast as I could, and when I got there, I told my parents about the threat. My mom begged my father to take us to my grandparents' house, which was far from that town. It was the only way to escape. But we didn't have time. That same night, we were jolted awake by something supernatural. We were sleeping when we woke up to loud banging at the door. We all got up. My father asked who it was, and at that moment, we heard a familiar voice. It was the voice of my uncle, Santino. We stepped back from the door. I was covered in chills because my uncle had passed away a year earlier. The banging grew louder, and the voice echoed, "Open the door, my brother. I'm tired and hungry." My father took 2 steps toward the door, but my mother held him back. The thing outside started walking around the house, calling out my father's name. When it passed by the window, we saw its shadow. I remember it as if it were today. It looked like a huge, dog-like man with pointed ears and hunched over as it moved forward, covered in long, dark fur. My father seemed to be in a trance, unable to believe that this thing was imitating his late brother's voice. My mother dragged us into the bedroom, the safest room in the house, with a sturdy door. The werewolf began clawing at the kitchen door. It would break down any moment. Suddenly, it came to the bedroom window, where we could hear it growling and scratching the wood, trying to pry it open. At that moment, we ran out of the bedroom and into the bathroom. The bathroom was cramped, barely enough for the 6 of us to fit. My siblings were softly crying, and I was trying to calm them. The werewolf was running back and forth, slamming into the door, pressing against the window, growling. It was a night of sheer terror, until finally, everything went silent. I asked my parents what kind of creature that was, and in a terrified whisper, my mother replied, "It's a werewolf, son." Even now, I get chills remembering that moment. I'd never felt such fear in my life. We only left the bathroom when daylight broke. Outside, there were large footprints on the ground and scratches all over the door. My father quickly told us to pack our clothes. We didn't even have bags. We threw what we could into burlap sacks and left without anyone seeing. We walked a long distance to the edge of town, where a bus passed that would take us to other towns. We arrived at another town by nightfall, staying with my grandparents for a few days before moving even farther away. I can say with certainty that I've seen a werewolf, and I know they're everywhere. This happened to me when I was just 11, so when I see people doubting stories like this, it infuriates me. Only God knows how terrifying that moment was. I don't know who the werewolf was, but I'm sure it was sent by that family. Hello everyone, my name is Diego. I've been in this group for a few months, following the stories about lycanthropy, and today, I decided to share one of the tales I often heard from my grandfather when I was a kid. In the 1940s, my grandfather Francisco was riding down a road in a cart with his father. Along the way, the horses started to pull back and refused to move forward, no matter what. So, my great-grandfather told my grandfather to prepare himself because there was probably something up ahead on the road. With great effort to get the horses to move, they eventually passed in front of a cemetery where they saw the werewolf everyone talked about, a huge, very hairy creature that reeked and had terrifying yellow eyes and enormous ears. For some unknown reason, this creature did nothing. It just stood there, watching as they passed along the road. My great-grandfather, paralyzed with fear, asked my grandfather, "Did you see that in front of the cemetery?" My grandfather, speechless, simply nodded yes. Whether it was truly a werewolf, I don't know, but it's a real story my grandfather experienced. I remember he always told it with utmost seriousness. I'll share more stories from my family in the future. I hope you enjoyed my story. Good night, everyone. Hello. I remember it was Lent, a time filled with many eerie stories passed down from my parents and grandparents. The most fascinating tales were always about werewolves, but I never really believed in those things. Though I loved the topic, I didn't believe in it, at least not until that night. For about 2 nights in a row, I heard a deep, heavy breathing followed by a horrible, decaying stench filling my room. I always ignored it because I was too scared to check it out. My window was usually open to let fresh air into the room, but that night, I regretted leaving it open. I got up slowly to see what on earth was making that noise and causing that terrible smell. And to my misfortune, what was there was not from this world. I'd say it was the devil himself, in the form of a large black dog with elongated arms and a terrifyingly evil stare. I couldn't believe what was in front of my eyes. As I accidentally bumped into the table where the fan was, that hellish creature let out a haunting growl, jumped over my yard wall, and disappeared into the darkness of the night. The thing that scares me the most is knowing that for many nights, it was just there, quietly watching me sleep. Even now, with the windows shut, I fear that it might be there again, just behind the steel bars, watching while I sleep deeply. Good night.